The executive floor of Sterling Global went quiet the moment Victoria Sterling turned her cold gaze toward the man standing at the back of the conference room. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Everyone in that room understood that a single sentence from her could end a career. And everyone waited to see whose career it would be that morning. Ethan Walker stood with his hands folded in front of him, his gray suit unremarkable, his face unreadable. He had said only a few words about a system risk. Nobody else in the room seemed willing to acknowledge. "If you do not like the way I run this company," Victoria said, her voice flat and precise, "then quit." Laughter rippled across the table. Daniel Brooks laughed the loudest, leaning back in his leather chair as though he had just watched a joke land perfectly. Nobody in that room believed a quiet operations manager in his 40s would actually walk away from a paycheck that size. Victoria certainly did not believe it. She turned back to her tablet, already moving on to the next item on her agenda, already certain the moment was over. Ethan did not laugh. He did not argue either. He simply closed his laptop with a soft click, unclipped the badge from his belt, and set it gently on the polished table. Then he reached under his desk outside the room, pulled out an old cardboard box, and began placing his belongings inside it, one at a time. A photograph, a worn notebook, a chipped coffee mug that had sat on that desk longer than most of the people in the building had worked there. The smile on Victoria's face faded slowly, the way color drains from a sky before a storm. She watched him through the glass wall of the conference room, watched the calm, deliberate way he moved, and something in her chest tightened without her understanding why. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself a man like that was replaceable, that everyone in this building was replaceable, that this was simply how modern companies worked. Then, less than 10 minutes later, her phone began buzzing without pause. The trading systems had gone dark. Warehouse inventory numbers no longer matched shipping records. Client accounts froze mid-transaction. Somewhere deep inside the architecture of Sterling Global, something had begun to unravel, and nobody standing in that boardroom understood why or how to stop it. That was the moment Victoria realized the man who had just walked out the door was not an ordinary employee at all. He was the only person left alive inside that company who understood how the whole fragile structure actually worked. Outside, in the parking garage beneath the building, Ethan set his cardboard box gently on the passenger seat of an old sedan that had served him faithfully for more than a decade. He did not look back toward the glass tower behind him. He did not check his phone, though it had already begun buzzing quietly in his coat pocket. He simply started the engine, adjusted the mirror, and drove away as calmly as he had walked out of that boardroom minutes earlier, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Inside the building, however, panic was beginning to spread from floor to floor, like smoke finding every open window. An assistant knocked frantically on Victoria's office door, her voice trembling as she explained that 3 separate departments had already called in the same complaint within minutes of each other. Nothing was syncing, nothing was confirming. Numbers that should have matched perfectly across systems now told 3 different contradictory stories at once. Victoria waved the assistant away at first, certain this was simply an ordinary technical hiccup, the kind that resolved itself within the hour, without requiring her personal attention. She had learned, over years of running fast-moving companies, that the loudest problems were rarely the most serious ones. This time, however, the assistant did not leave. She stood in the doorway, refusing to move, until Victoria finally looked up from her screen and understood, from the expression on the young woman's face, that this was different. Ethan Walker had always arrived before the sun came up, long before the first assistant switched on the lobby lights. Long before the espresso machine in the break room finished its warm-up cycle, he was already at his desk, reviewing overnight reports with the same steady patience he brought to everything else. When the office printer jammed, as it often did on Monday mornings, he was the one who knelt down and cleared the paper himself, rather than waiting for a technician. When new hires wandered the floor looking lost on their first day, he was the one who walked them to the right department and explained where the coffee filters were kept. He never took credit for any of it. He never mentioned the projects he had quietly saved from collapse, the reports he had corrected before executives ever saw the errors, The late nights he spent making certain the numbers added up so someone else could present them with confidence the next morning. To most of the staff at Sterling Global, Ethan Walker was simply the aging operations manager who had been there longer than anyone could remember, a man too cautious for a company moving as fast as this one wanted to move. Daniel Brooks made sure that impression stuck. As Vice President of Strategic Development, Daniel had built his entire career on being the loudest voice in every meeting. The first to propose bold ideas, the quickest to remind everyone how forward-thinking he was. Ethan's caution annoyed him. Every time Ethan raised a concern about outdated infrastructure or rushed system changes, Daniel found a clever way to make it sound like fear, like an old man clinging to a way of doing business that had already died. Victoria had purchased Sterling Global only 8 months earlier, inheriting an old family-adjacent conglomerate that badly needed modernizing. She believed in speed, she believed in youth, in fresh instincts, in stripping away anything that slowed down decision-making. To her, a workforce full of veterans who had spent decades doing things the old way was not an asset. It was a weight dragging her company toward the past. Ethan tried, more than once, to warn her. He explained, calmly and without drama, that the core systems supporting the entire supply chain had been patched together over many years, that certain safeguards existed for reasons nobody currently on staff fully remembered, that removing them without a proper transition plan could cause failures that would ripple through every department at once. Victoria listened, or appeared to, her eyes occasionally drifting toward her phone. She thanked him for his input. Then she moved forward with the changes anyway. One afternoon, standing in front of the entire leadership team, she made her position clear. From this day forward, she announced, her tone leaving no room for debate, I will remove anyone who cannot keep up with the pace of this company. Nobody looked at Ethan. Nobody needed to. Everybody in that room already understood exactly who those words were meant for. The boardroom felt colder than usual on the day everything finally broke apart. Sunlight came through the tall windows in long, pale strips, falling across a table covered in printed reports nobody had bothered to read closely. Victoria sat at the head of the table, flipping through a proposal to eliminate what she called redundant control systems. Systems designed decades earlier to catch errors before they became disasters. Ethan raised his hand slightly, the way he always did before speaking. A habit that made him seem more like a school teacher than an executive. These checks exist for a reason, he said quietly. If we remove them without a proper transition, we will not know something has gone wrong until it is already too late to stop it. Victoria's jaw tightened. She had grown tired of hearing caution dressed up as wisdom. To her, it sounded like fear wearing a suit. You are always so certain that slower is safer, she said. Maybe it is time this company stopped being run by people who are afraid of the future. Daniel jumped in immediately, eager as always to widen the gap between them. He reminded the room that every delay over the past several months had somehow traced back to Ethan's department, that every missed deadline seemed to carry his fingerprints somewhere in the explanation. It was not entirely true, but it sounded convincing. And convincing was all Daniel ever needed. Victoria's temper finally broke. If you do not like how I run this company, she said again. Louder this time. Sharper. Then quit. The room erupted into laughter, the same laughter as before, confident and dismissive. Nobody believed he would do it. Victoria certainly did not. She had said things like this before to other employees, and they had always folded, apologized, promised to fall in line. She expected the same from him now. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then, in a voice as calm as still water, he said one word, "Okay." He stood up, gathered the folder in front of him, and walked toward the door without another glance back. Victoria watched him go, arms crossed, utterly convinced this was a performance, a bruised ego looking for attention. She turned back to her papers, already dismissing the moment from her mind. She had no idea that within the hour, everything she believed about control and power was about to collapse. The trouble began quietly enough. A shipment tracking number failed to sync with a warehouse database in Ohio. An assistant reported it as a minor glitch, the kind that resolved itself after a quick reboot. Nobody thought much of it. Then a second discrepancy appeared. Then a third, spreading through the system like cracks branching across a windshield. By early afternoon, the servers supporting 3 major distribution centers had frozen entirely. Orders could not be confirmed. Inventory counts no longer matched what warehouse managers could see with their own eyes standing on the floor. Client accounts, especially the largest and most sensitive ones, showed transactions stuck halfway between processed and pending. Vanishing into a kind of digital limbo, nobody in the building knew how to reach. Phones began ringing across every department. Furious calls from logistics partners. Anxious calls from investors who had grown used to smooth quarterly performance. A handful of long-standing clients threatened to pull their contracts entirely if the issue was not resolved by the end of the business day. Daniel tried to manage the chaos the way he managed everything, by assigning blame quickly and loudly. He insisted the technology team had failed to properly test the new system changes before deployment. The technology team, exhausted and frightened, pushed back just as hard. "This is not our failure," one senior engineer finally said, standing in the middle of a crowded control room, sweat visible on his forehead under the fluorescent lights. "Nobody here understands this architecture the way Ethan Walker does. He built half of it himself, years ago, before any of us were hired. Without him, we are guessing." For the first time since she had purchased Sterling Global, Victoria said nothing at all. She stood at the edge of the control room, watching red error messages multiply across screen after screen, feeling something she rarely allowed herself to feel in front of other people: uncertainty. Grace Nolan, chairwoman of the board, and one of the few people who had worked alongside Ethan long before Victoria ever arrived, found her standing there in silence. Grace's expression carried none of the usual boardroom formality. It carried something closer to concern, and perhaps something closer to pity as well. "Do you honestly not know who he is?" Grace asked quietly, her eyes fixed on the chaos unfolding across the monitors. Victoria turned to her, confused, tired, unwilling yet to admit how frightened she had become. "He is an operations manager," she said. "A good one. Reliable. That is all I have ever needed him to be." Grace studied her for a long moment before answering. The kind of look a teacher gives a student who has just failed to notice something painfully obvious. "That is not all he has ever been," she said, "not even close." 15 years earlier, in a very different world, Ethan Walker had been known by another name entirely. One whispered with a mixture of respect and quiet fear across Wall Street. They called him the silent fixer. When companies stood on the edge of collapse, when boards had exhausted every option and investors were preparing to walk away, someone eventually suggested calling Ethan Walker. He rarely appeared in headlines. He avoided cameras, avoided interviews, avoided the kind of self-promotion that most men in his position seemed to crave. Instead, he worked quietly behind closed doors, untangling failing supply chains, rebuilding broken financial structures, saving thousands of jobs at companies most people assumed were already finished. Several major corporations, teetering on the edge of total collapse, existed today only because Ethan Walker had spent months rebuilding them from the inside out. Then, without warning to the industry that depended on him, he disappeared. His wife had died after a long illness, one that consumed years of his life in hospital waiting rooms and quiet nights spent holding her hand while machines beeped steadily beside her bed. When she was finally gone, something inside Ethan changed permanently. The empire of numbers and negotiations that had once defined his identity suddenly felt meaningless beside the silence left behind in his house. He walked away from finance entirely. He turned down every offer that came afterward, no matter how large the number attached to it. He wanted stillness. He wanted ordinary mornings, quiet evenings, a life measured in small, manageable moments rather than headlines and stock prices. Grace revealed that Sterling Global itself had approached him more than once over the years, long before Victoria's father passed the company down to her. Each time, the offer included extraordinary compensation, a seat on the board, more authority than most executives could dream of holding. Each time, Ethan had declined without hesitation, without negotiation, without ever explaining exactly why. Grace remembered the last time her old friend had personally flown across the country to make the offer himself. Sitting across from Ethan, in a quiet restaurant, sliding a folder of numbers across the table that most men would have accepted before finishing their coffee. Ethan had listened politely, thanked him for the gesture, and gently pushed the folder back without opening it. He explained only that he had already lost the one thing worth building an empire for, and that no title or salary could replace it. Victoria's father had left that dinner disappointed but strangely respectful, telling Grace afterward that he had never met a man so thoroughly unimpressed by his own fortune. Instead, Ethan had accepted a modest position deep within the company's operations division, far below the level his reputation could have commanded, asking only that nobody make a fuss about who he used to be. He wanted a desk near a window. He wanted work that mattered, without demanding recognition. For 15 years, he had kept that promise to himself quietly, showing up early, staying late, solving problems most executives never even noticed existed, content to remain the invisible foundation, holding up a building full of people who barely knew his name. Grace continued speaking, her voice softer now, almost nostalgic, describing evenings long ago when Ethan's name still carried weight in every serious boardroom across the financial district. She remembered watching him walk into failing companies that everyone else had already written off as lost causes, watching him ask patient, careful questions until the true source of a crisis revealed itself, usually somewhere far simpler and far more human than anyone expected. He never arrived with dramatic solutions. He arrived with patience, and patience, Grace explained, had always been the one thing this industry consistently underestimated. She spoke, too, about the difficult months after his wife's passing. How colleagues who once respected him had quietly stopped calling. Assuming grief had made him unreliable, assuming a man who no longer wanted the spotlight had somehow lost his usefulness entirely. Ethan never complained about the silence that followed. He simply built a smaller, quieter life for himself. One where nobody expected miracles from him anymore. One where he could finally exist without an entire industry treating his worth as measured only by what he could produce. Victoria felt the floor shift slightly beneath her, the way it does when a person realizes a story they believed completely has an entirely different ending than they expected. "You are telling me," she said slowly, "that the man I just fired is someone my own father once tried to hire." Grace nodded once, her expression unreadable. "You did not just fire an operations manager," she said. "You fired the one person who might have kept your father's company from falling apart before your very eyes." The crisis spread faster than anyone at Sterling Global could contain. By the following morning, financial news outlets had picked up the story, describing an unexplained systems failure, crippling one of the country's fastest-growing conglomerates. Stock prices dropped sharply within hours of the opening bell. Analysts speculated publicly about mismanagement, about a young CEO who had moved too quickly without proper safeguards in place. Inside the company, the damage compounded by the hour. Shipments that should have left warehouses on schedule sat frozen in loading docks. Drivers waiting beside idle trucks with no instructions. Factory lines that depended on synchronized inventory reports slowed to a crawl, then stopped altogether. Customer service representatives fielded call after call from furious clients, demanding explanations nobody could give them. Daniel, sensing an opportunity to protect himself, doubled down on his earlier claims. He suggested to several board members, quietly and carefully, that perhaps the failure had begun long before the current crisis, buried deep in outdated systems that Ethan himself had built and never properly documented. It was a clever lie, wrapped just tightly enough around a partial truth to sound believable. Victoria refused at first to reach out to Ethan directly. Pride kept her rooted in place, convinced that admitting she needed him would mean admitting she had been wrong in front of an entire company watching her every move. She brought in outside consultants instead, expensive specialists flown in overnight, each one promising a quick solution. None of them understood the architecture well enough to repair it. Every attempted fix only created new problems layered on top of the old ones. Warehouse workers in Ohio stood beside idle conveyor belts for hours at a time, uncertain whether to go home or wait for instructions that never seemed to arrive. Truck drivers slept in their cabs outside loading docks, engines off, waiting for paperwork that existed somewhere inside a system nobody could reliably access. A regional manager, exhausted and near tears, told a reporter off the record that she had never seen anything like this in her entire career, that the company felt like a ship taking on water with nobody left who remembered where the emergency pumps were kept. Customer service lines grew so overwhelmed that the company was forced to bring in temporary staff simply to answer calls, most of whom had no actual solutions to offer beyond polite apologies and vague promises of resolution. Small business owners who depended on Sterling Global for steady inventory found themselves scrambling to find alternative suppliers overnight, some of them publicly airing their frustration in interviews that only deepened the company's growing reputation crisis. Analysts who had once praised Victoria as a bold young visionary now began questioning aloud whether she had the experience necessary to steady a company this large during a genuine emergency. Victoria spent long nights in her office reviewing report after report, dark circles forming beneath her eyes, coffee going cold beside stacks of printouts. She no longer had the patience to read carefully. She called in favors from old contacts, hired specialists from 3 different consulting firms, authorized emergency budgets that would have made her wince under ordinary circumstances. None of it mattered. Every fix applied to one part of the system seemed to create a new failure somewhere else entirely, as though the architecture itself was rejecting every hand except the one that had built it. By the 3rd day, Sterling Global's largest strategic client, a distribution partner responsible for nearly 1/5 of total annual revenue, issued an ultimatum that finally shattered whatever pride remained in the boardroom. If Ethan Walker does not return to oversee this recovery personally, the client's representative said over a tense conference call, his voice cold and final, "We will terminate our contract by the end of this week." Victoria sat in silence after the call ended, staring at the darkened screen in front of her, finally understanding that there was no version of this crisis she could solve alone. She found him exactly where Grace had guessed she would, at a modest house on the edge of town, far from glass towers and boardroom windows. The paint on the porch had faded slightly with age, but the garden surrounding it was carefully tended, rows of vegetables growing in neat lines, a wooden bench positioned beneath a large oak tree. Ethan knelt in the dirt, sleeves rolled up, planting something new in the late afternoon light. He did not look surprised to see her. If anything, his expression carried a quiet resignation, as though he had known this visit was inevitable from the moment he packed his box 3 days earlier. Victoria stepped carefully across the gravel path, rehearsed words already forming in her mind, offers of raises, promotions, an expanded role with real authority attached to it. She began speaking before she had even fully approached him, listing figures and titles as though numbers alone could repair what had broken. "I can offer you the position of Chief Operating Officer," she said. "Full authority over systems and infrastructure. A significant equity stake. Whatever number you want, name it." Ethan straightened slowly, brushing dirt from his hands, and looked at her with an expression that held no anger at all, only a tired kind of clarity. "I did not leave because of money," he said quietly. "I left because of respect. Those are 2 very different things, and no contract you write can replace the second one." Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she genuinely did not know what to say. Ethan turned back toward his garden without another word. The conversation clearly finished in his mind, if not in hers. Rain began falling softly moments later, the kind of steady rain that soaked through fabric slowly rather than all at once. Victoria stood outside his gate for a long time afterward, watching the porch light glow through the mist, unwilling yet to accept that closing a door could truly be the end of the story. She noticed, standing there in the rain, small details about his home she had somehow missed on her way in. A child's wind chime hung near the porch, faded from years of weather but clearly cared for, never taken down despite whatever memories it carried. A row of tools sat neatly arranged in the open shed beside the garden, each one cleaned and returned to its proper place after use. The same quiet discipline he brought to every task at the office, translated here into soil and wood, instead of spreadsheets and reports. Through the window, before he drew the curtain closed for the evening, she caught a glimpse of a bookshelf crowded with worn paperbacks, a reading chair positioned exactly beneath a lamp, a life built entirely around simplicity, rather than the excess she had always assumed powerful men eventually surrounded themselves with. It occurred to her, standing soaked and cold at the edge of his property, that she had spent months working alongside this man, without ever once wondering what mattered to him beyond the office walls. She drove home slowly that night, the wipers struggling against the heavy rain, replaying his words over and over in her mind. Respect. Not money, not title, not power. A word so simple she had somehow managed to overlook it entirely, while building an empire meant to command exactly that kind of respect from everyone, except the people who worked for her. She left with nothing resolved, and for the first time in her career, that uncertainty followed her all the way home. Unable to sleep that night, Victoria began digging through old records instead, searching for something, anything, that might explain the man she had dismissed so easily. What she found unsettled her, more than the crisis itself had. Years earlier, Ethan had quietly declined an acquisition bonus worth several $100 million, choosing instead to walk away from the deal entirely, rather than support layoffs the new owners had planned. Buried deeper in personnel files nobody had reviewed in years, she discovered records of employees who had lost their positions during earlier restructurings, employees who had somehow, mysteriously, found new opportunities within months. Anonymous scholarship payments appeared beside several names, tuition covered in full for children of workers who had been let go through no fault of their own. No signature appeared beside any of these transactions. No name claimed credit anywhere in the paperwork. It took her considerably longer to trace the pattern back to a single source, hidden behind layers of legal structuring clearly designed to keep the truth private. Ethan Walker had been funding all of it quietly for years, asking for nothing in return, seeking no recognition whatsoever for what he had done. Even more startling was a name she found buried in an old file from more than a decade earlier. Daniel Brooks himself, before joining Sterling Global, had once stood on the edge of personal financial ruin after a failed business venture left him drowning in debt. Ethan had intervened quietly at the time, restructuring the debt privately, ensuring Daniel never lost his house, his reputation, or his ability to start again. Daniel had never once mentioned this to anyone. Victoria kept reading long after midnight, unable to stop turning through the paper trail Ethan had left behind, so carefully hidden. She found records of a night janitor whose daughter needed surgery. Her medical bills quietly settled through an anonymous fund that traced back, after several confusing layers of legal structuring, to the same source as everything else. She found letters from former employees thanking an unnamed benefactor for helping them start small businesses after layoffs left them without direction, letters that had been filed away and forgotten by everyone except the one man who had written the checks. She found a folder devoted entirely to a young engineer who had once been fired unfairly during an earlier round of cost-cutting. A mistake nobody at the company had ever bothered to correct. Ethan had personally written a letter of recommendation on his own time, using his old reputation quietly behind the scenes to help the young man secure a position at another firm, a position that eventually led to a thriving career. The engineer had no idea, to this day, who had actually helped him. None of it had ever been about recognition. Victoria began to understand, sitting alone in the glow of her desk lamp at nearly 3 in the morning, that everything Ethan Walker had built over the years existed in the spaces between the spreadsheets, in the quiet corners nobody thought to examine, in kindnesses distributed so carefully that even their recipients rarely understood where they had come from. When Victoria confronted him with what she had discovered, his confident posture crumbled almost instantly. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to explain himself, offering excuses that grew weaker with every sentence. Then, quite by accident, one of Victoria's assistants uncovered an old voice recording buried in an archived file, a recording nobody had listened to in months. It captured Daniel speaking privately to another executive weeks before the fateful boardroom meeting, coaching him carefully on exactly how to provoke Ethan into a confrontation loud enough for Victoria to overreact in front of the entire leadership team. Daniel Brooks had engineered the entire crisis from the very beginning. Victoria called an emergency meeting the following morning, gathering every senior executive into the largest conference room in the building. Rain still streaked the windows from the previous night, casting a gray, uncertain light across the long table. She stood at the head of the room, a laptop open in front of her, her expression harder than anyone present had seen it in months. She played the recording without introduction, without warning, letting Daniel's own voice fill the silence and speak for itself. Around the table, expressions shifted from confusion to disbelief to open anger as the truth settled in. Several board members exchanged glances that made clear exactly how this meeting was going to end. Daniel tried to interrupt, tried to explain, tried to reframe what everyone had just heard as something taken out of context. Nobody in the room was willing to listen. The evidence was too complete, too damning, too clearly aligned with every convenient excuse he had offered over the past several days. Grace spoke next, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had watched this company through many difficult seasons and had rarely felt this disappointed in a fellow executive. She reminded the room that Daniel had not only sabotaged a valuable colleague out of petty ambition, but had nearly cost hundreds of ordinary employees their livelihoods in the process, employees who had no part in boardroom politics and no protection against the consequences of decisions made far above their heads. Several executives around the table nodded slowly, the weight of that truth settling over the room like a held breath finally released. Daniel's composure cracked further with every passing minute. He tried appealing to old alliances, reminding certain board members of favors done years earlier, but nobody in that room was willing to spend their own credibility defending him now that the truth had been laid out so plainly. His voice grew thinner, more desperate, until finally he simply stopped talking altogether, staring down at the table in front of him, as though the polished wood might somehow offer an escape route he could not find anywhere else. By the end of the meeting, the board voted unanimously to remove him from his position, effective immediately. Security escorted him from the building less than an hour later, his belongings packed hastily into a box, far less dignified than the one Ethan had carried out days earlier. Victoria remained standing at the front of the room long after everyone else had filed out, staring at the empty chairs, feeling the full weight of what her impatience and pride had nearly cost the company. For the first time in her career, she prepared to apologize publicly, not to shareholders, not to the board, but to a single man who had asked for nothing at all in return for everything he had given. Ethan, however, still had not agreed to come back. Victoria returned to the small house on the edge of town 3 days later, arriving without the polished confidence that usually surrounded her. This time, she carried no contract, no folder of figures, no lawyer trailing a step behind her ready to finalize terms. She carried only a single handwritten letter, folded carefully into the pocket of her coat. Ethan opened the door before she could knock, as though some part of him had expected her return. He said nothing at first, simply stepping aside to let her onto the porch, out of the wind that had picked up since morning. Victoria hesitated, then pulled the letter from her pocket and held it out toward him with both hands. "I do not need you to work for me," she said quietly, her voice noticeably softer than it had been in that boardroom days earlier. "I need to learn how to become a leader people can actually respect. I am asking you to help me become that person, not because it will fix a broken system, but because I finally understand it was never really about the system at all." Ethan took the letter slowly, unfolding it with careful hands, reading each line in silence while Victoria stood waiting, unsure whether the ground beneath her would hold. When he finished reading, something shifted behind his eyes, a warmth Victoria had never once seen directed toward her before. For the first time since she had known him, Ethan smiled. A real smile, unguarded and genuine, reaching all the way to the corners of his tired eyes. "There is one condition," he said finally, folding the letter closed again. Victoria straightened, bracing herself for a demand she could not possibly refuse. Ethan explained the condition slowly, deliberately choosing each word with the same care he brought to everything else in his life. There would be no special privileges attached to his return, no private office designed to separate him from the people actually doing the work each day. No title dressed up in polished language meant to impress outsiders rather than describe honest responsibility. Every decision made inside Sterling Global going forward, he said, needed to place people ahead of profit whenever the two came into conflict. Employees needed to be treated as human beings first, resources second. Leadership needed to listen before it spoke, and admit mistakes before pride convinced anyone otherwise. Victoria agreed without hesitation, understanding for the first time in her adult life that some conditions were not obstacles standing in her way, but gifts offered by someone who genuinely wanted to see her succeed. Ethan returned to Sterling Global the following week, though not as an employee bound by the same hierarchy that had dismissed him so carelessly months earlier. He returned instead as an independent strategic advisor, free to speak honestly in every meeting without fear of being silenced, free to walk away again at any moment should the company ever forget the lesson it had barely survived learning. Over the following year, the transformation inside Sterling Global proved remarkable. The company recovered financially within a matter of months. Systems rebuilt properly this time, with input from the very people who understood them best. Beyond the numbers, something deeper changed as well. The culture inside the building shifted, slowly at first, then unmistakably, as employees who had once felt disposable began to feel valued instead. Meetings grew quieter, more thoughtful, less driven by fear of consequence, and more focused on genuine solutions. Younger employees who had once been afraid to speak honestly in front of leadership found themselves encouraged instead, their ideas taken seriously rather than dismissed for lacking polish. Sterling Global, once known throughout the industry for its ruthless pace and disposable workforce, slowly became known instead as a place where people actually wanted to build a career. The night janitor whose daughter had needed surgery received flowers on the anniversary of her recovery. A small gesture nobody outside the immediate department noticed, though Victoria made certain it happened every single year afterward without exception. The young engineer who had once been fired unfairly was quietly welcomed back into a senior role, given the chance to rebuild what an earlier, careless decision had taken from him. Ethan never asked for any of these gestures to be acknowledged publicly, and Victoria never offered to make them public either. Understanding now that the value of such things lived precisely in their quietness, new hires walking through the lobby for the first time were no longer greeted with the cold, hurried indifference that had once defined the building's atmosphere. Instead, someone always took the time to walk them to their desk personally, to explain where things were kept, to make certain they did not spend their first difficult morning wandering the halls feeling invisible. It became something of an unspoken tradition among the staff. One nobody had to enforce with policy or memo, simply because enough people remembered what it had once felt like to matter to no one at all. Even the physical space of the building seemed to soften over that year, though nothing structural had actually changed. The break room, once a place people hurried through on their way back to overworked desks, slowly became somewhere employees lingered a few extra minutes, trading stories, checking in on one another the way colleagues rarely bothered to when everyone assumed they might be replaced by the following quarter. Productivity, strangely enough, climbed steadily throughout the year, a fact that several outside analysts found difficult to explain using any of their usual models. Victoria changed as well, though the change came slowly, the way most meaningful change tends to arrive. She learned to sit quietly in meetings rather than filling every silence with her own voice. She learned to ask questions instead of issuing orders, to listen for concerns rather than dismissing them as excuses standing in the way of progress. Near the end of that year, on a quiet autumn evening when the office had mostly emptied out for the day, Victoria found herself standing near Ethan's desk, an invitation prepared carefully in her mind, rather than written on paper this time. "Would you have dinner with me?" she asked, her voice carrying none of the sharp authority it once had. "Not as my advisor. Not as someone I once fired, just as two people who have somehow learned to respect each other along the way." Ethan looked up from his desk, studying her for a long moment before answering. Something had softened between them over the past year. Something neither of them had planned for, neither of them had expected, and yet both of them recognized clearly now that it had been growing quietly all along. "I would like that," he said simply. They walked out of the building together that evening, side by side rather than as employer and employee, the city lights beginning to flicker on around them as the sky slowly darkened. Neither of them rushed to define exactly what this evening meant, or what evenings might follow it in the months ahead. There was no dramatic declaration, no sudden confession spoken beneath streetlights, the way stories sometimes demanded. Instead, there was simply the quiet, steady comfort of two people who had each lost something important once, who had each rebuilt themselves slowly and carefully afterward, and who now found themselves walking the same direction without either one having to ask the other to slow down. Grace watched them leave from her office window on the top floor, a small, knowing smile crossing her face as the two figures grew smaller against the evening skyline. She thought of the countless offers Sterling Global had extended to Ethan Walker over the years, every single one he had refused without explanation. She thought, too, of Victoria's father, of that quiet dinner years earlier where a folder of numbers had been pushed gently back across a table, unopened. He had never learned what it would take to earn a man like that back into the fold. Though he had spent years wondering, Grace found herself wishing, in a small private way, that he could have seen this evening, could have watched his daughter finally understand the lesson he himself had never quite managed to teach her. Down on the street below, Ethan and Victoria walked without any particular hurry, pausing once outside a small restaurant to read the menu posted in the window, laughing quietly about something neither of them would ever repeat to another soul. There was no grand declaration between them, no music swelling to mark the moment as significant. There was only the ordinary, unremarkable comfort of two people learning, slowly and honestly, how to build something worth keeping. The city moved around them the way it always did, indifferent to the quiet transformation that had taken place inside one glass tower over the course of a single difficult year. Somewhere above, Grace finally turned away from the window, satisfied in a way she rarely allowed herself to feel, and returned to the stack of reports waiting patiently on her desk. Sterling Global would face other challenges in the years ahead, as every company eventually does, but for the first time in a long while, it faced them with the right people finally standing in the right places. Perhaps, Grace thought, closing the blinds against the last of the evening light, Ethan Walker had simply been waiting all along for a version of this company, and a version of its leader, finally worth returning to.